It was the spring of 1968 when Eric Clapton first stood in Abbey Road's famed Studio 2 and heard George Harrison's delicate introduction on the unassuming demo of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. At 23, Clapton was still learning that fury and fineness had to share the frets. He recalls the moment George walked in, pale and quiet, carrying his Gibson for just one take. After the last note faded into the tape loop, George looked at Eric and said, "Fancy lending me a lead." Clapton slid onto the stool, fingers trembling, and fashioned the song's iconic solo in one improvised run. When they listened back, George turned to him and smiled softly. "You found its heart," he said. In that instant, Eric understood George's rare gift. He could invite you to bare your soul on his stage, and feel perfectly safe doing so. Their friendship bloomed in the most unlikely quarters. The Yardbirds' Eric Clapton and the Beatles' George Harrison shared a billing at the Seville Theatre in London and crossed paths backstage among clattering cymbals and winding cables. George, already deft at slide guitar, admired Clapton's blues mastery. Clapton envied the effortless chorus that followed George wherever he went. After dinner one evening, George passed Clapton a napkin with two simple chord diagrams, Gima 7 Sma J7, and urged him to taste the sweetness in major sevenths. Eric, who'd spent years chasing every minor pentatonic nuance, found those chords unsettlingly lush. They felt like sunlight after a thunderstorm, he says now. George taught me that beauty could be as potent as pain. By 1969, their collaboration took shape on George's quasi-solo project Blind Faith. Clapton joined Harrison and Steve Winwood for one self-titled album, and Eric remembers George's composure in the control room as they mixed Can't Find My Way Home. While Clapton fussed over every guitar nuance, George sat serene, nodding like a Zen master. When Clapton fretted about the song's sparse vocal echo, George waved him off. Silence lets a voice breathe. That guidance reshaped Clapton's recording ethos. From then on, he embraced space as eagerly as sustain, learning that restraint could ignite emotion in ways relentless licks never could. Despite their musical kinship, a complex tension underlay their rapport. By the early 1970s, Clapton was captivated by Pattie Boyd, George's first wife. Eric's trembling confession, "I'm in love with your wife," fractured their bond. George's measured reaction stunned him. He didn't rage or file for divorce immediately. Instead, he invited Clapton to help record his All Things Must Pass sessions at Abbey Road, pacing Eric privately with quiet looks of disappointment. Clapton felt both shame and gratitude that George spared public spectacle, but yearning for the brotherhood they once shared. In his diary, he later confessed, "I hated him more than anyone for loving me too well." All the while, George's spiritual compass guided him through Clapton's addiction and heartbreak. When Clapton collapsed after an overdose in 1976, George was one of the few who answered the phone. He flew from Friar Park to London in his Rolls-Royce Phantom, checked into Eric's hospital ward, and whispered, "Stay with us." Years later, Clapton said that moment, George's unwavering presence at his bedside had saved his life. Yet even in that act of mercy, a fracture remained. Clapton's unspoken guilt at receiving grace from the man whose wife he'd loved. Their fractured brotherhood resurfaced on George's Dark Horse tour in 1974. Clapton joined the band unbilled to help smooth over George's struggling vocals. On stage at the Los Angeles Forum, George soldiered through throat problems, and Clapton's support licks filled the gaps. Backstage, George credited Eric with saving the show, but Eric felt no triumph, only the bitter sting of being the secret savior. He confided in a friend. "He called me his family, but I was always living on his forgiveness." Nonetheless, George continued to elevate Clapton's career. He introduced Eric to Phil Spector, set him up with sessions for Layla and other assorted love songs, and even searched for a cure to Clapton's worsening heroin habit. When a private trip to an ashram in 1970 provided Clapton his first taste of inner calm, he credited George's introduction to transcendental meditation. And yet, whenever Clapton tried to express gratitude, George would only smile and deflect. "We're brothers in song," he'd say. "That's thanks enough." Each dismissal felt generous, but also a reminder that their connection existed on George's terms. Tonight, at 80, I sit in my living room with my worn Fender Strat and a stack of Harrison's handwritten lyric sheets. I play through every chord the man taught me. Major sevenths, suspended chords, that sweet Cad 9 ending on, "My sweet Lord." And I recall the night I finally asked, "Why do you keep me in your life after all I did?" George simply looked at me and said, "Because you found the missing strings in my songs." For decades, that line echoed in my heart. And now, at last, I confess the truth about George Harrison. He was the only man who could do that to me, make me fear his gentle strength, respect his unyielding love, and finally guide me to tell the world the music that lived in both our souls. In the summer of 1970, I found myself standing backstage at New York's Madison Square Garden, fresh off the final leg of Blind Faith's short-lived tour and still reeling from heartbreak over George's wife, Pattie Boyd. George had invited me to join him on stage for the concert for Bangladesh, and his calm confidence hit me more sharply than any riff ever could. That night, before I stepped into the floodlights, George pulled me aside and laid a steady hand on my shoulder. He said, "This is bigger than guitars, Eric. We're here to heal, not just to play." His quiet gravity forced me to swallow a lump of shame and step into the spotlight with purpose. As I launched into further on up the road, I felt the weight of his belief in me, his only real demand, to play for something greater than my own sorrow. The concert for Bangladesh marked our first major collaboration since the George Harrison double LP, All Things Must Pass, and I replayed every moment in my mind for years. I watched George walk onstage clutching his signature Fender Telecaster, his easy smile belying the tensions underneath. In the dressing room, I saw his face fall when he heard the roar of 80,000 fans chanting, "George! George!" a fervor that threatened to drown out the very purpose of the evening. I listened as he muttered, "It's for the children," over and over, as if that mantra held him upright. After set break, I found him alone near the stage wings, wiping sweat from his brow. I handed him a towel and told him, "You're saving more lives tonight than most people save in a lifetime." He nodded, eyes distant, and said, "We're only instruments in their hands." Friend. In that exchange, I recognized the depth of his selflessness. Only George could redirect all that adoration toward a cause instead of himself. A few months later, in early 1971, George and I convened at Friar Park to plan my solo debut album. He showed me his Laurel Canyon demos and suggested I drop my usual frenetic blues outbursts in favor of melodic space. He pressed me to feel the song's essence. It's breathing room, he called it, rather than simply attack each chord. I resisted, insisting that raw emotion lived in every scratch and slide. George merely smiled and offered a cup of tea from the ancient oak trees on his estate. As the steam curled between us, he said, "Your silence in the studio can speak louder than your solos, Eric." Reluctantly, I played a sparse acoustic take of "What's Happening" and watched his face soften. When the first test pressing arrived months later, I heard not only my vocals but the echo of George's lesson, "Restraint is revelation." Though his generosity often uplifted me, the shadow of my affair with Pattie Boyd loomed large. In 1974, when George was touring Europe with Delaney and Bonnie, I flew to Brussels under the pretense of a session mix, but really to apologize. I found him alone in a cramped Antwerp hotel room, thumbing through lyrics for his upcoming album. His expression was hollow, yet he offered me a seat and poured us each a whiskey. In the half-light, I choked out, "I never meant to hurt you." He leaned back, eyes closing, and whispered, "I loved her too much to hold a grudge, Eric. But I won't help build your regrets." That final admonition cut deeper than any quarrel, and I left knowing our friendship would never be quite the same, but grateful that George's forgiveness never came with strings attached. Their paths crossed again in 1966 at a charity fundraiser for Cambodian refugees at London's Hammersmith Odeon. George was headlining, and I'd flown in to sit in for a surprise duet on "Here Comes the Sun." We rehearsed backstage, two old friends hearing our voices mesh after years of silence. At last, he nodded and said, "Let's bring some hope tonight." On stage, as our guitars intertwined under spotlights, I felt a surge of redemption, not because I'd regained George's trust, but because music could heal fractures that words could never mend. After the final chords faded, he clasped my hand and held it high, as if to declare to the audience we had each played our parts in the same story once more. That same year, I battled opening night nerves for my first Valentine's Day concert at New York's Beacon Theater. George, ever the quiet supporter, arrived in the dressing room with a small box. Inside lay a silver slide he'd used on "My Sweet Lord." He winked and said, "Slide through your anxieties." I used that slide on the very first solo, crescent notes that cut through my jitters like a soothing balm. The applause that followed was thunderous, but I saw George's nod in the wings as the true ovation. His belief that my music could transcend personal turmoil stayed with me through every stage fright after that. Tonight, as I sit in my home studio, I keep George's Telecaster pick, a battered white shard, tucked in my guitar case. It reminds me that he was the only man who could do that to me, to coax me beyond self-pity, to teach me the power of silence, to hold me accountable to humanity over ego. At 80, I finally tell the world George Harrison's steady hand, his unassuming brilliance, and his boundless heart shaped not only my sound but my very soul. In the early 1980s, after years of heroin addiction nearly claimed me, George Harrison became my anchor once again. I'd retreated to a cottage on the Suffolk coast, exhausted and withdrawn, believing I'd lost every shred of purpose. One misty dawn, I heard a knock on the door. George stood there wearing his faded denim jacket and a soft smile. In one hand he held a black Fender amp head, in the other, a tin of fish and chipped grease, insisting on cooking us breakfast in my makeshift kitchen. "Food first, then music," he said. We sat on old wooden stools as he fried cod and chips, and I found slow comfort in his quiet generosity. Afterwards, George suggested we take that amp head out to the dunes and play whatever came to mind. He said, "Let the sea air blow the cobwebs from your hands." I followed him through the shifting sands and felt, for the first time in months, a spark of life returned to my fingers. George's healing touch extended into the studio during my 1981 album, Another Ticket. I drafted a song called "Lay Down, Sally," a sweet, two-chord shuffle that felt too naive for my demons. George listened patiently to the demo tape, then placed his acoustic beside my Strat. He said, "Let's slide through the grief before you belt it out." He added a melodic falsetto harmony on the chorus that lent the track its unforgettable warmth. When "Lay Down, Sally" climbed the charts, I felt the pinprick of pride and the deeper knowledge that George had steered me toward my own best work without imposing his own vision on me. Their paths converged most famously on George's 1987 reunion tour, the Cloud9 sessions that led to the Traveling Wilburys. George coaxed me into a Los Angeles studio where he'd assembled Jeff Lynne, Tom Petty, and Roy Orbison. I arrived wary, uncertain how I'd fit among those iconic voices. George greeted me with a wink and said, "Just lend your hand, we'll find the rest." In one improvised take of "Handle with Care," my bluesy bends wove through the song's bright riff like a secret undercurrent. George turned up the mix until my solo sat gently atop the ensemble, then clapped me on the back. "You're home," he said. That camaraderie, sparked by George's welcoming spirit, became one of the finest chapters of my career. A testament to the man who never failed to show me the power of humble collaboration. Off-duty, George guided me through my 1991 Battle Studies tour, encouraging me to weave and cover versions of Beatles cuts as heartfelt tributes. On a cold London evening at Wembley Arena, I stepped on stage with "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" in hand. When the opening chords rang out, the audience hushed as if sensing George himself was tuning every string. I played George's solo note for note, letting the raw emotion sustain in the arena's haze. At the end of the final refrain, I dedicated it aloud. "This one's for George, the man who taught me to weep through my guitar." Later, backstage, I found a folded note from George. "You made her weep for us both." I still keep that note in my wallet, a silent reminder that George's gift was always to show me the heart beneath my riffs. In 1994, as I recorded Pilgrim, my first album after re-entering the studio post-rehab, I struggled to channel genuine emotion into lyrics that felt too introspective. George sent me a bottle of jasmine oil from his garden at Friar Park and a letter that read, "Sent Carrie's memory. Use it to find your words." I diffused the oil in the control room and wrote, "River of Tears." In a single take, the fragrance unlocking emotion I'd boxed away for years. My producer later told me that track stood as Pilgrim's emotional centerpiece, and I knew it was George's simple gesture that had opened the floodgates. The pinnacle of George's generosity came in 2001 when he produced my album Reptile in his Friar Park studio. He coached my backing vocalist to sing in unison on "Trouble," transforming my lament into a chorus of shared resolve. George explained that unity in voice symbolized unity in spirit. "A musical bridge over troubled water," he said, echoing a Paul Simon lyric because George loved weaving connections across genres. When Reptile debuted to critical acclaim, I credited George's production notes as the unseen backbone of the record. Even after George slipped into Parkinson's and pulled back from public life, he continued to support me with handwritten postcards. On my 70th birthday, I received an envelope stamped with "Handmade in England." Inside was a watercolor of a white dahlia and 3 words, "Keep bending truth." That simple phrase encapsulated our 4-decade friendship, his belief that truth emerges in every bend of a string and every break in silence. Tonight, as I sit in my recording booth at age 80, I hold George's beloved slide, a chrome wedge he lent me on a whim, and trace its worn edges. I think of every moment he humbled me, prodded me, healed me, and celebrated me. George Harrison was the only man who could do that to me, coax me beyond ego, guide me toward compassion, and forever remind me that the sweetest notes are those touched by grace. In the autumn of 2002, I flew to London for the concert for George, an all-star tribute at the Royal Albert Hall honoring my dear friend's life and legacy. When Ravi Shankar's sitars faded and the orchestral overture ended, I stepped to center stage clutching my beloved Stratocaster. I opened with, "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," channeling every memory of George's gentle lesson in vulnerability. Mid-solo, I felt his spirit beside me, his voice echoing in every bend and every slide. After the final note hung in silence, the entire hall rose as one. It was the only time I ever truly wept on stage. George was the only man who could do that to me. A month later, I joined George's widow, Olivia, and son, Danny, at Friar Park to help establish the Material World Charitable Foundation in George's name. Standing in the shadow of his beloved manor, I watched Olivia unveil the foundation's first grant recipients, musicians using art to foster peace. George had long spoken of music's power to heal, and I, who'd known his heart better than most, felt the full weight of his vision. At the reception, Olivia presented me with a framed lyric sheet of "My Sweet Lord," annotated in George's handwriting. I hung it in my home studio, a daily reminder that he was the only one who could do that to me. Teach me to weave devotion into every song. In 2003, I returned to the studio to record Brainwashed, George's posthumous album produced by Danny and Jeff Lynne. I lay down a slide guitar track on the closing song, Horse to the Water, infusing each note with the grief and gratitude I carried. When I heard my playing splicing through George's vocals on headphones, I felt an ache that only he could awaken. Later, as I lent my name to a benefit screening of the George Harrison documentary Living in the Material World, I told audiences how George had taught me that the purest music arises from quiet faith. By 2004, I'd converted my Antigua retreat into the Crossroads Center rehabilitation facility for those battling addiction, guided by some of George's same compassionate ideals. I recalled our 1970 evenings discussing Eastern medicine and holistic healing at his home, and I built Crossroads to offer both therapy and music workshops. That first cohort included former rockers and local youth learning guitar, clearly echoes of George's method of sharing his art to uplift others. When Crossroads opened its gardens to a small concert featuring Yoko Ono and Jeff Beck, I stepped forward and raised a toast to George, who showed me that recovery is a song we write together. In that moment, I felt both of their spirits singing in harmony. In 2006, on my 60th birthday, several friends surprised me by commissioning a guitar crafted from oak planks salvaged from Harrison's childhood home. Carved around the sound hole were George's words, "When you pull it, let it speak your truth." That guitar, my Friar Park Strat, became my go-to instrument for intimate performances. On live-stream gigs during the 2020 lockdown, I sat in my home studio with that guitar and played "Here Comes the Sun" for isolated fans. The warm chords carried across the internet, and in comments I saw messages like, "I feel his warmth through your strings." In those streams, I realized George was the only one who could do that to me. Teach me to bring his light anywhere, even through a screen. Most recently, I guest curated a George Harrison and Friends exhibit at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I selected original paintings of Indian deities George had commissioned and his iconic Dan Electro guitar, alongside my first slide that he gifted me in 1974. In my curator's remarks, I confessed, George was the only man who could open my heart with a single chord. Visitors left tears in their eyes and new awareness of George's quiet influence on so many. Now, at 80, I sit in my home studio, his annotated lyric sheets on the wall and that oak plank Strat in my arms. When I'll play my final chords, no one knows, but as long as music remains in me, his gentle guidance endures. George Harrison was the only one who could do that to me. He unlocked the heart of my music, healed my wounds, and showed me that every soulful note is a testament to love beyond words. In 2003, when the concert for George wrapped its triumphant run, I felt compelled to carry George Harrison's spirit forward through my own work. That year, I launched the first Crossroads Guitar Festival in Dallas, a benefit for my Crossroads Center, a rehab clinic built on the lesson George taught me healing belongs in community. I invited a lineup of guitarists who owed their inspiration to George's melodic sensibility, from Derek Trucks to Sheryl Crow to Jeff Lynne. Between sets, I quietly slipped backstage to stare at George's photo on the green room wall, his serene eyes reminding me why I'd founded Crossroads to transform pain into purpose. When the festival netted millions for addiction recovery, I saw firsthand how George's generosity had shaped my own, The only man who could do that to me had shown me the power of giving back. The following year, 2004, I contributed slide work to the reissued edition of All Things Must Pass, George's masterpiece that changed my approach to solo recording. I recorded a new guitar overdub on Isn't It a Pity, adding a mournful counter melody beneath George's organ swells. When I listened to the remaster, I felt George's presence in every echo, his encouragement to trust the song's pain even as I colored it with my blues heritage. Fans wrote in, saying the new layers brought them closer to George's heartbreak. I mailed George's widow, Olivia, a note saying he was the only one who could teach me that sorrow is the sweetest note. Her reply, "He lives in your strings," became engraved on my amp head, a silent tribute in every unplugged performance since. In 2005, I traveled back to Friar Park with Donnie Harrison to record acoustic versions of Harrison's early tracks for the Brainwashed documentary. George's house was in shadowed autumn light, ivy clinging to weathered stone. Donnie offered me the first cup of tea he'd ever made, and we sat at the oak-shuttered windows listening to George's demos on a battered reel-to-reel. When he cued the demo of All Those Years Ago, Danny invited me to play a complimentary slide solo. I felt George's hand on my shoulder as I found the lick that echoed his guitar's voice. Later, Donnie hugged me and said, "He wanted you here." That moment sealed our bond. George's son had chosen me to carry forward his father's music, the only man who could do that to me, passing the torch through his own blood. A decade later, for the 2012 50th anniversary celebration of the Beatles' first single, I joined Paul McCartney on stage at the O2 Arena, and at one point I dedicated my solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps to George. Clutching my Strat, I addressed the roaring crowd. This one's for the quiet Beatle who taught me how to weep. The tremolo in my opening note carried a lifetime of gratitude and grief. When I finished, I looked toward the stadium lights as if hoping George might hear it. The audience's cheers echoed like a chorus of angels, proof that George's melody still moved millions and that he was the only man who could do that to me. In 2015, I accepted the Kennedy Center honors alongside Olivia Harrison. On stage, President Obama paid tribute to George's contributions to music and peace, and when it came my turn, I stepped forward and said, "I stand here because George Harrison showed me that power lies not only in rhythm, but in compassion." I revealed a brass harmonica George had once handed me on a London backlot and played its single, quivering note. The entire concert hall fell silent in reverence. I felt George's approval beneath every muted breath, knowing that only he could teach a guitar hero the value of a single, fragile note. That same year, Olivia invited me to curate a Beatles exhibit at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I selected George's Reverend Green electric guitar, the handwritten lyric sheet for Something, and his hand-drawn diagrams for slide positions. I organized the gallery to lead visitors on a journey from George's Liverpool roots to his spiritual awakenings and final works. In my curator's remarks, I closed by recounting our first Abbey Road session and how George nudged me to speak my heart through my guitar. The exhibit drew thousands. Many moved to tears at the panels captioned, "George's Gift to Eric Clapton." Their reactions reminded me that George's influence endured far beyond his own lifetime, and that he was the only one who could do that to me. As I reflect on these decades of friendship and collaboration, I realize that every festival, every tribute performance, every reissue and exhibit has been an act of gratitude. George Harrison's quiet generosity, to draw vulnerability from my playing, to stand by me in pain, to uphold my art as a form of redemption, continues to shape my every note. At 80, I honor him not only in words or music, but in every heartbeat that carries his gentle spirit forward. And though I know my final chords will one day fall silent, I will forever confess the truth. George Harrison was the only man who could do that to me. In the stillness of my home studio, I often reach for the treasured notes George Harrison once slipped under my door, frail scraps of paper edged in his delicate handwriting. At 80, I keep those notes pinned above my amp. Phrases like, "Let the silence tell the story," and "Trust every bend of the string." Each morning as sunlight filters through the Venetian blinds, I read a single line aloud, letting it settle into my spirit before I tune my guitar. That ritual connects me instantly to George's gentle counsel, reminding me that the greatest music often arises from the pauses between our words. As the Crossroads Guitar Festival approached its 10th anniversary, I reflected on George's influence in every charitable venture I'd undertaken. We shared a conviction that music could heal real wounds, and in George's honor, I established a songwriting workshop for veterans struggling with PTSD. Every June, We gather in the Laurel Canyon Hills, once George's creative retreat, where I teach slide techniques and melody crafting, urging participants to sing their truth, much as George taught me. When I see their eyes light up as they coax soulful notes from battered guitars, I feel George's spirit in their courage to transform pain into art. In 2018, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's Beatles, Then and Now exhibit invited me to curate a section devoted to George's slide guitar legacy. I selected his milestone steel guitar and the red Telecaster he played on the concert for Bangladesh. Beside each instrument, I placed my own Stratocaster and George's handwritten slide diagrams, inviting visitors to straddle our combined influence. At the opening gala, I spoke of George's quiet power, how one simple chord could unlock empathy in a crowd. Observing guests trace each fret with awe, I realized George was the only man who could teach me that empathy can resonate louder than volume. That same year, I returned to Friar Park with Danny and Olivia to record a short tribute documentary. We filmed by the koi ponds and under the ancient cedar trees, capturing the hush that George once claimed held as much meaning as any lyric. Danny interviewed me about our Beatles-era sessions, and I shared video clips of our impromptu jam by the lake. As I recounted George's coaxing words, "Breathe life into every measure," I saw tears on his children's faces. It was proof that George's bedside manner extended beyond our music into the hearts of everyone he touched. Over the past 5 years, I've partnered with the British Library to digitize George's personal notebooks, making them accessible to scholars and fans alike. I worked with archivists to transcribe pages where George sketched chord progressions and antidotes for creative block. The first public reading I did, at the library's reading room, drew emerging songwriters who sat spellbound as I recited George's notes on slide positioning and lyrical economy. Each time someone turned a fragile page, I felt gratitude for the man who had entrusted me with his most private creative thoughts. In 2021, I accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Americana Music Association. On stage, I held the wooden plaque carved in George's oak leaf motif and spoke of how George's first lesson to listen beneath the buzz reshaped every melody I ever played. I shared a brief solo of "Here Comes the Sun," reinterpreted through a mellow, jazz-inflected rhythm as a final salute. When the audience rose in standing ovation, I understood that George's legacy, his modest grace and profound musicality, remained as vivid as ever. Now, as I prepare to step back from touring and focus on studio work, I carry George's teachings into my final chapters. I'm composing a suite of instrumental pieces titled Friar Park Reverie, each movement sparked by places on his estate, woodland paths, walled gardens, the tranquil koi pond. I intend to record these in my cottage nestled beneath the Carmel Hills, so his influence permeates every note, every chamber resonance. It feels like a fitting full circle. The lessons he taught me in England now echo across the Pacific. Tonight, as I cradle my Strat before bed, I whisper a final confession. George Harrison was the only man who could do that to me. To see past my macho bravado, guide me into stillness and shape every tremor of my guitar into truth. In every chord I play, in every studio session I lead, his spirit stands beside me, teaching me still that the sweetest resonance arises when a guitar's voice aligns with the heart. And for that, I remain forever grateful.